Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Empyrion Galactic Survival episode 212. I'm Enigmius and today we are working on the Discovery. I bet you're a little bit surprised, but that's what we're doing. Last episode we got the ship moving. Basically we got some thrusters in place so that the ship can move around. It moves quite a bit faster than I expected it would be able to do, which is not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. And now we're kind of in the final stretch where I'm looking at the ship and I'm looking at some of the things that I've done up to this point. I'm very happy with most of it. There were some things that just seemed like a good idea at the time, and in the end I wasn't particularly satisfied with. One of those was the underside of the main hull area. After I put in the thrusters in this general area, the main propulsion thrusters, I noticed it was just kind of a little bit too stubby. Like there's basically like a bulb underneath the ship that helps to hold the deflector dish. That's what it's for, is the structure around the deflector dish. And it wasn't really filling out the way that I would have hoped it would. So that's what we're doing now, is we're just extending it back a relatively short distance. Nothing especially complicated. It's just a 22.5 degree compound angle kind of thing we've done countless times in a variety of different ships for a variety of different reasons. And now we're just extending it back so that it flows a little bit more organically with the rest of the ship and the way the hull is kind of working in various different places, as opposed to this stubby little round thing sticking underneath the deflector dish and kind of behind it. It was a last minute thing that I looked at and decided it wouldn't take very long, so it would be worth my time. And you can see there the dark area being what we just added relative to the rest of the hull. It just kind of makes it work a little bit better, I found. And then it's just a matter of filling in some of the cosmetic details. We're looking at the transitions, how this new part that we've added fits with the rest of the hull. Does it fit with the rest of the hull? And kind of smoothing things out so that it looks again like it was there by design and not an afterthought, if we can manage it. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. Not an especially complicated thing to begin with, but having done it now, I feel like it was significant enough to warrant the attention, and it took so little time that it's impossible to look at it now and say that I did the wrong thing. For me anyways. Maybe you'll disagree, but that's kind of my take on it. One of the other things that I wanted to look at was the front of the main hull section, above and to either side of the deflector dish. Now when I originally, you see I'm trying to paint that stupid little piece in the corner and it just wouldn't take color. But moving on, this area up here, see how it's like a straight line all the way across the top, and it's this narrow sort of pair of 22.5 degree angles coming together. My thinking at the time when I put this in place was that this is sort of a part of the hull that's going to be nestled up against the outer ring of the saucer section, and so we want to have it close, and sort of, I don't know how many people would even consider this, but the way I was looking at it is the closer that we can get it and have it look like it was intended to be that close, the more cool it looks, because of the tight tolerances on something so large that could go catastrophically wrong if something was out of alignment when the outer ring started to spin around. That was my thinking at the time, was to have it kind of working its way up against the saucer section without actually touching it, and that's why we had the weird angle, and that's why I let it run straight across, as I didn't want to get it too distracted with the structure, trying to make it go around in circles or anything like that, following the shape of the outer ring. It was something that when I was finished putting in place, I wasn't happy with it to begin with, but at the same time, I couldn't really come up with something that I would prefer to such an extent that I would be willing to go through and rework it. It's again one of those things where I put it in place. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I disliked it from the beginning, but I knew there was going to be so much time that it would sit there for me to come up with an idea that I was actually going to like, that I didn't really feel like I had to just change it for the sake of saying that I changed it. We could leave it for a little while, and then once everything comes together, we can put things together in a way that Saves me a little bit of time messing around with various different things, none of which that I like, just because I feel like I'm obligated to change it because I recognize that I don't like it to begin with, that sort of thing. So you can see here, I'm basically starting from the middle and working my way out at this point, removing a little bit of the wedge sort of shape and then filling it in, and then removing a little bit more and filling it in, and eventually we'll go to the outside edges and start removing them from there and filling everything in so that we get to a place where I'm actually happy with what's going on at the edge. I'm not really looking for something that looks fantastic. I'm looking for something that doesn't distract from the deflector dish. And what I found, the thing that I liked least about this whole original setup, was that it was such a straight line. It was a long straight line running right across the top, and it pulled at the eye even more than what was going on with the deflector dish. Probably because the simplicity of it and the way that it was out of place. Whereas the deflector dish, you kind of look at it, even if it's lit up and it's got all kinds of, you know, fun, sparkly things going on, it doesn't necessarily, at least to me, seem out of place. It looks, you know, interesting, but you've still got that simple thing that's pulling at your mind because it's right there and you can't avoid it because it's so big. And that was sort of the issue that I had with it. So we're just kind of taking that leading edge and breaking it down a little bit and coming up with something that's got a little bit more contour to it, that flows a little bit better with all of the other things that are going on around it, and ultimately ends up being just a subtle thing that's there. And ideally, you wouldn't necessarily think about it, but if you did look at it and kind of give it a little bit of attention and stop and think about what went into it, how it's put together, you wouldn't think, because that's kind of the standard is, if you look at it and your first thought is, then it's probably not the best thing that we could come up with. Now, this part here is mostly just sort of integrating the little bit of detail around the thrusters with what we're doing, extending the hull in that direction. We were passing close enough to it that I decided, rather than sort of ignore it and have the top section kind of just going across and then the sides of the thrusters coming up completely independently of one another, it would make sense to have a little bit of integration so that things flow a little bit together. And I'm pretty happy with the decision to do that. It would have saved a little bit of time to just kind of ignore it and leave everything else as it was. But for the little bit of extra time that we spent, I think it came together fairly well, all things considered. There's a tendency, I think, for me anyways, when looking at something that starts out, some things that I have in mind that I want to do and I do them and it seems easy, I keep wanting to do those things. Like we put this kind of slightly more elegant, more curved sort of structural element on the outer edges of this leading edge across the top, and then kind of merged it with the sides going down around the thrusters. And I really like the way that it turned out. It's very subtle. It's got some curves to it. It's got some heft to it. You look at it and you feel like it's sort of the front end of a spaceship. The tendency, I think, is to want to continue doing stuff like that. And at one point in my mind, I thought it would be a good idea to have sort of like this wavy thing going across the top. And I'm so glad that I caught myself and said no, because that's sort of the opposite of having something that's so simple and so large and so glaring that you can't do anything but look at it. The same thing happens if it gets too busy and too crazy, and you look at it and you think, okay, regardless of how well the blocks may or may not fit together, why? Why would you have this bizarre wavy line across the top of the main hull of your spaceship? So fortunately, I managed to intervene on my own behalf and get rid of it. You can see I was starting already. There's a little notch right above and to the right of the thrusters, and that was going to be the start of another little bulge that would have pushed its way across and then sort of gone back towards the hull and then back out. But I managed to clear it out, and overall much happier with the end result. I can look at it now and feel like that particular part of the ship even though it's my own design, it's not trying to duplicate anything from the actual ship itself. We've talked about why. It's still something that I can look at and say, I'm happy with that part of the ship now. I can move on to something else and not feel like this is going to be a negative element if I don't come back to it and do something about it. So a little bit more fine tuning. This is just making the transition a little bit better around the deflector dish, but ultimately it's done, and I'm pretty happy that it's done. And it didn't take, again, just like the part where we started on the back end, it didn't really take all that long. Now, the other thing that I wanted to do in this episode, and I hadn't actually planned on doing it in this episode, I thought that doing this front end and the stuff in the back as well would take longer than it did. And by the time I got everything edited down and ready to consider rendering and putting out, I realized it was just over 10 minutes. And it would have, at this point, felt like a waste. So I decided to push it a little bit longer for the sake of accomplishing something that we haven't done, instead of just another episode where we're modifying things that we've done before. And I wanted to put those light bulbs, for lack of a better term, on the front of the nacelles. So I mentioned when we put the reverse thrusters on the front of the nacelles that they kind of mimicked two of the smaller blue sort of light fixtures attached to the front of the nacelles. And then I remembered at some point seeing that the central light emitting sort of thing was red. And I was just looking at an image of the ship, and it's blue in the image, in that image. And then I looked around and I found more that were red. So it could be red or it could be blue, this particular part that we're looking at. But basically we've got the two thrusters mimicking the blue lights. They're a little on the smaller side, and then in between them and slightly above them is a much larger sort of fixture that emits either blue or red light. In our case, we're going to make it red. So I need to include a certain amount of glass in order for this to work. It's just the nature of the beast. And working with glass, if you've been following this series, you know, isn't my most favorite thing in the world to do, just because it's very limited in terms of the shapes that we have access to, and getting everything to line up also can be a little bit time consuming. I'm trying not to make it sound more negative than it is. It's just you can orient the blocks in different ways, and they look like it's, you know, for example, these 1x2 22.5 degree slant windows. It looks, you can have them in two different orientations so that it looks like it's both of them are slanting in the same direction, but they come together with other blocks differently at the edges. So you have to kind of mess around a little bit and make sure not just that the block looks oriented the way that it's supposed to, but also that it's meeting up with the blocks around it the way that you want it to. Otherwise, you end up with something that looks just very strange and not very good at all. So there's a little bit of time, extra time involved in that process, just getting things lined up the way that you want it to. And also, again, referring to the limited number of blocks at our disposal, it means if you want to make a particular shape, you really at times have no choice but to incorporate solid blocks as well, just to be able to keep things working in the direction that you need them to, in between the kinds of glass blocks that will actually fit in the places that you need them to fit in order to create that shape that you're looking for. So you can see here we've got a certain number of armored glass panes, and then we've got some combat steel in between them that we're basically using to keep the shape going in the direction that we want it to, which is kind of a dome sticking out the front of the nacelle is one way to describe it. It's not a perfect sphere. I'm not using any kind of geometrical reference material this time around. I'm just kind of putting it together by the seat of my pants and considering things where I have to use solid blocks, trying to minimize the role that they play as much as possible so that they don't stand out more than the glass. If we have to have them, I would like to have them as subtle and as discreet as possible so that you can focus on the more interesting bits, which in this case will hopefully be a fairly intense light shining through this particular section of the ship. So now we've gotten around to basically getting the main shape laid out, which is always a very nice thing. A shape like this is probably one of the more difficult things to lay out, because we're working in a relatively small area and we're trying to create something that changes direction many, many times. It's basically constantly changing direction because it's sort of almost like a sphere. It's never really moving in the same direction for very long at all. So we have to constantly evaluate what blocks we're using, how they fit together, where we need to take that next row of blocks, what direction they have to go in, at what angle, all of these different things. So for something this size, where it's usually the smaller it is, the more difficult it is to make all of these things come together, to turn out the way that it did, again, was something that I wasn't expecting to go as quickly as it did, but of course, certainly not complaining. So we've got that basic dome shape. We've got a little bit of solid blocks showing through, but I'm okay with it. It's coming together in a way that they aren't really, to me, looking at them, drawing at my attention too much. So now it's just a matter of working this transition. We've got this shape, we've got this dome made mostly out of glass sticking out of the front of the nacelles, and we have to try and figure out a way to make sure that it transitions with the rest of the structure so that the edges aren't the thing that you end up looking at the most. So it's a little bit of time spent looking at where the transition is, where it's coming together with the different angles on the hull and on the dome, and working back and forth between the two until we come up with the collection of blocks that produces the shape that we're the most happy about, while knowing that it's probably not going to be anywhere near our ideal perfect. It's just, you kind of take what you can get, and maybe along the way, learn something from the process and what blocks you used and the outcome that you got. And if it's something that you can use in a later build, great. If it's something that you learned just didn't work, that's kind of good too, because it saves you a little bit of time the next time when you think, yeah, maybe I'll try that, and then you remember, no, that didn't work. That didn't work at all. It comes together fairly nice. The main thing, once I got this done, and I'm not going to make you look at the whole process of kind of cleaning up on the inside and placing the lights and all that other stuff, but just by texturing the inside with the glossy metal finish and putting in a bunch of maximum intensity range red lights, it still didn't really kind of give you that sense that it was a red glowing sort of thing, because it's just the light and all it can do is reflect off the things around it. So the hull around the outside of this sort of dome had a red sort of glow going for it, but the inside of the dome, where it was supposed to be the most intense, there was hardly anything. You could see the individual lights inside, which was kind of counterproductive. I wanted the whole thing to be glowing. So what I ended up doing, and again, I'm not going to waste your time showing it because it's just building a wall, was I built a wall in behind the dome and textured it with the glossy metal finish, painted it red for the same reason that I painted some of the other things blue when we were working with blue lights, just so that even if you can't see the lights, you might be able to see the color, and it kind of keeps it, there's a continuity to it. And then with that in place and the lights doing what the lights do, we ended up in a position where we were getting something that I feel is about as close as we're going to get to what I had in mind. So I like this shape. The shape made me happy. Everything came together all right. We got the transition worked out for the dome to the hull in a way that I was happy with. And that just put us in a position where we had to kind of take a look around and see what we had when we turn the lights on and get everything set up. So the next episode, more stuff that we need to do in order to get it finished so that we can release the blueprint for this ship. We're getting very, very close. So I don't know specifically what we'll be doing, but you kind of get the idea that we're making progress. So if you want to be notified about the next episode, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.